we're hearing from Krishna about Gyan. This chapter, as we mentioned, it's called Jnana Yoga. Srila Rupa Goswami quotes Sridhar Swami about Gyan in his anthology known as Padyavali. Gyanam asti tulitam chutulayam, prema naiva tulitam natulayam, siddhireva tulitatra tulayam, krishnanama tulitam natulayam. It's poetic. What he means is that non-devotional knowledge, you can weigh that on a scale, but love of Godhead can never be weighed with anything. It can never be compared to anything. Scale means a balancing scale, like you see in the markets. Mystic perfection can be balanced on that same scale, but never the holy name of Krishna. The idea is that Krishna Nam and Krishna Prema, these things are not comparable to anything else, so then why are we discussing Gyan? What is the value of Gyan? Our concern with Gyan began when in this chapter, at least in this particular passage. Back in text number 33, after Krishna was talking about various kinds of yajnas, he told Arjuna something. What did he tell Arjuna? He said, Sarvam karma akhilam partha jnane parisamapyate. Of all the karmas, remember karma means dharma, and dharma means yajna. And Krishna's been discussing yajnas up until now. So of all this stuff, he said the conclusion is in Gyan only. And then he says, Tadvidhi pranipatena pariprashnena sevaya ityadi. And where do you get the Gyan from? You get it from a guru. That's one point. Exactly what the bona fide guru will teach you, that has been nicely described in Baladev Vidyabhushan's commentary, back on text 35, the one after that. He wrote, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, Baladev Vidyabhushan. He said that for those jivas who are distinct from their two bodies, what two bodies are we talking about? How many bodies do you have? Huh? People think I've got one body. No, sir. There's this body, but remember we talked about the antakarana. That's another kind of body, sukshma sharir. Sthula sharir and sukshma sharir, these two. So for people who are identified with these bodies, but jivas, we're by nature distinct from them. And when we're opposed to the Lord, thinking only of our own benefit, Krishna says, my external energy furnishes us with a sense of possessiveness regarding these material bodies and whatever facilities these bodies possess. That's called false ego. By that maya, they can also take on the conceptions of the person who is the killer and the person who is killed. This is a context. We're talking about a battlefield. If you're in the sabzi mandi, then we're taking on conceptions of I'm the person buying the vegetables, or I'm the person selling the vegetables. Or if you're in a family, then you're thinking I'm the wife and he's the husband. And he's thinking I'm the husband, she's the wife. Adi, adi, adi. We have so many different conceptions of life. Just like the air carries aromas, Krishna says. So our true, pure forms don't have any relationship with these bodies or with this material world. And the Lord of everything supplies to us, under the shelter of these bodies and senses, means to support ourselves and to provide us with happiness and enjoyment in whatever planets we choose to inhabit, according to our karmas. And then if we ever eventually get sick of this, then he also gives us the means to get out. That's called liberation. The point that Baladev Vidyabhushan is making here is that the person who actually understands all this, in other words, the person who has knowledge, he never becomes bewildered. And because he's never bewildered, he doesn't commit sinful activities, which we've already heard from Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. Somebody in knowledge will not commit sin. Now, here's the interesting thing about this discussion. For the rest of this chapter, from this point on, we're going to hear, if we can read between the lines, we're going to see that receiving this kind of sambandha gyan from the spiritual master, bona fide spiritual master, this knowledge will allow us to serve the spiritual master in the way that Krishna suggested back in text 34. You remember, he mentions knowledge first in text number 33, when he says all this pious activity should culminate in attaining some realization. And then he points out in the next verse that that realization is actually bestowed upon us by the divine grace of the spiritual master. And now what we're hearing from Krishna in all these verses, there is a common denominator, and that is that this knowledge, sambandha gyan we call it, this allows us to actually properly serve the spiritual master. That's a very, very important point. Even though it's not explicit here, it is explicit elsewhere. We'll get to that in a moment. So, for example, when Krishna says in text 38, coming up, I guess, day after tomorrow, Nahi jnanena satrisham pavitramih vidyate tat swayam yoga samsiddha kalenatmani vindati. What does it mean? In this world, there's nothing so sublime and pure as transcendental knowledge. Such knowledge is the mature fruit of all mysticism, and one who has become accomplished in the practice of devotional service enjoys this knowledge within himself in due course of time. Why does Krishna say that there's nothing so sublime and pure as transcendental knowledge when we know that bhakti is actually above knowledge? The fact is that realized knowledge is what allows us to subdue our senses and whatever our senses desire. We don't have any material desires. None of us does. Is that true? You have material desires? Raise your hand if you have material desires. You don't have to raise your hand. But the fact is that you don't. Your body has material desires. Your mind has material desires. Your senses, your false ego has material. You don't have material desires. We don't see this. That's what it means to be in ignorance. This is why transcendental knowledge is important. If we have transcendental knowledge, then that knowledge allows us to subdue our senses and our minds, and thereby attain enough peace that we can be very steady in serving the order of the spiritual master, serving the spiritual master. Remember, this is how Krishna said, Pariprashnena seviya, in text 34. You cannot do that, actually, until you have transcendental knowledge, and that's why we're so concerned about it in this chapter, and for the rest of the book, for that matter. So, therefore, Krishna says in the next verse, Shraddhavan labhate jnanam tatparaha sanyatendriyaha jnanam labdhva param shantim achirenadhigacchati. A faithful man, bookmark this, faithful. Everybody say, faithful. A faithful man who is dedicated to transcendental knowledge and who subdues his senses is eligible to achieve such knowledge. And having achieved it, he quickly attains the supreme spiritual peace. We're not stable in our service, and we're not devoted enough in our service because our minds and our senses are not peaceful. They're not allowing us to be like what Krishna says earlier at the end of chapter 2, like an ocean. There's no ocean in Vrindavan other than the ocean of love of God. The Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu ocean is here. But for those who live near the ocean, you know, all kinds of things are flowing into the ocean. Sewage is going into the ocean. Rivers are going into the ocean. Rainfall, that's so many things. But the ocean is always very placid, very flat, stable. Ocean, you know, it has its tides, but they never go way beyond what it's supposed to be. At least not yet. We'll see what Kali Yuga has in store in the future. We're already seeing crazy weather, so maybe the tides will also change. We don't know, but Krishna says we're supposed to be like that. We're supposed to be very placid, very stable, and very peaceful. In that consciousness, we can actually practice devotional service with mature commitment and determination, that's what's required to really gain Krishna's attention.